Professor Barry Golding is the patron of the Australian Men's Shed Association, and he actually got into that by being the president of Adult Learning Australia. And as you know, we just heard in the last session from Sally Thompson, who's the CEO of Adult Learning Australia, a very interesting third speaker. Barry Golding is also Associate Dean of Research at the School of Education and Arts at the University of Ballarat. He's leader of RAVE, Researching Adult and Vocational Education Group, manager of the Men's Learning Beyond the Workplace International Research Project, and one of 3 voluntary patrons of the Australian Men's Shed. So, this is I want to know about Men's Shed. How does the whole Men's Shed movement fit into the kind of learning we've been talking about today and the benefits it has?
I think the best way of starting talking about it is to recognise that the World Health Organisation recognises that people are well for a number of universal reasons. And for anyone who's from the health sector will know there's what's called the social determinants of health. And one of the key things for people being well, doesn't matter how old they are, whether they're 10 or 50 or 90, is to actually be socially connected. And any form of social disconnection leads to changes in people's social and health status. The other things are things like, obvious things like having meaningful work, eating well, and not doing drugs or alcohol or smoking. And they're the things that make us well. And so to link that to men, we know that the health stats for men in many parts of the world are very poor, and men live for many years less than many women. In places like Estonia, it's actually a 13-year difference between men and women. Men on average die 13 years earlier than women. Now, when you look closely, you find that men have actually done a fair bit of risk-taking, worked pretty hard, smoked, had a lot of alcohol and smoke. But the other thing is suicide stats. Every day in Australia, 5 men kill themselves. And that happens every day on average. And as another patron of the Australian Men's Sheds Association says, if 5 whales beached themselves today in Sydney Harbour, it would be front page news. And so there's a whole underlying thing about older men in particular not necessarily being well. And what my research and other people's research shows that men who finish work for whatever good reason or often find it very difficult to cope post-work. Our research basically shows that people who are in work are generally well and happy as long as they're not damaged by work. But people who aren't in work are actually sometimes in a difficult space they didn't anticipate, particularly if they, as some of our earlier speakers said, if they lost their job in circumstances they had no control over. So that sort of leads into the idea of men's sheds.
So tell us what exactly, can you explain what men's sheds are? Well, we know what men's sheds
are. How many people have been inside a men's shed? Okay, some people know. They're all different. They started in Australia. For a long time, men have done stuff in their own sheds. And 15 years ago, somebody said, what would happen if instead of doing stuff in our backyard sheds, we did it in a community setting? It's that simple. And so what's happened is, and it started in Australia, it's less than 8 years ago that people actually first sat in a room and talked about men's sheds in Lakes Entrance in 2005. That was the first time that anyone had spoken about it. There's now 900 men's sheds in Australia. There's 50 men's sheds in Ireland. There's 100 sheds already open in Ireland, 50 in New Zealand, sorry. So there's around 1,200 men's sheds in the world. It's a grassroots, bottom-up organisation. And it's really struck a chord, particularly with older men. And this being national seniors, half of the men are over 65. But importantly, They're not men you would necessarily see in this forum. That's really
So they're one of the other groups of learners.
To take Sally's cue, they're the, well, some of them are, and it's important to note that many of the men in the room here could do some really good stuff in men's sheds by doing some of the legal work and doing some of the management work and helping with the budgets. But one of the quite stunning things when you go to the Victorian Men's Sheds Association meetings, and they have them all around Victoria, is that there are men with the backside hanging out of their pants in their work boots in the meeting. I can't see any men in their overalls today. But although there are some men who dress like us, the people who go to the conferences aren't the coordinators, they're actually the men themselves, which is quite stunning.
So how does it actually operate? Like, it's a not-for-profit, it's locally organised, and how do men know to go? How do you get there?
They're run locally and they're all different. There's some sheds which are just for men with dementia. There's some sheds that are organised by War Veterans Associations, RSLs, which are made for war veterans. There's some sheds which do mentoring work for young kids who won't go to school, and they, in a sense, they're doing apprenticeships with kids. They're just all, and that's the other thing, they are all different. And they match the needs of the men in that particular location. And when people say, why aren't they all the same? I say, it's because it's not McDonald's. They don't have to be the same. In the end, it has to meet the needs of the men who set it up. And they range from humongous sheds like one in Ballarat, the Ballarat East Community Shed, their shed space is 3 times as big as this room. And as you know, size matters for men. When it comes to their sheds, they talk about how big their sheds are. That's the first question.
That's why they're men's sheds.
That's right. Oh, sorry, I had to do that. But ranging to one in Bunyong, just out of Ballarat, where there's 8 guys who meet in a garage. It's not a community space. So it's a whole range of different. There's a national organisation called the Australian Men's Sheds Association. They get some funding from the federal government to organise the sector, but there's also a state association.
So can I just ask, for the purposes of the topic here, the way in which you differentiate social interaction from learning? Because clearly there's a lot of there's social interaction, but it's not just entertainment. There is it's task-oriented and bonding through some kind of acquisition of skill or
yes,
knowledge.
it is. Look, men. My research and research of other people show that when you ask men what do you most want to know, and this is older men, what men most want to know is how to stay fit and healthy. But they don't have anywhere to go to do it. And they certainly, if someone said to a man, you're not healthy, I'm going to make you healthy, they'd say, well, I won't say what they'd say, but they wouldn't, in a sense, men's sheds work because they don't actually name the activity. It's called the Horsham Men's Shed, or the Dalesford Men's Shed, where I come from, or the Creswick Men's Shed. It doesn't say Creswick Learning Centre, it doesn't say Creswick Health Centre, it doesn't say Creswick Anti-Suicide Centre, it doesn't name the activity, and by not naming the activity, it empowers men to do stuff. And so when people say, what do? I say they do stuff. And people say, what stuff's that? Well, I said, depending on what stuff do men want to do. Some men just come and have a cup of coffee. Some men with a disability just sweep the floor. Some men do highfalutin engineering and really precision stuff, craft work. But some men don't do anything. And I think that's the important thing about it. It's not what you have to do, it's what you do in your own time, which is discretionary. And the interesting thing that comes through from our research is that when you ask men a whole series of questions, the one that got the most agreement is that men feel at home. And that's really, really, really important. So it has to have a social space. And some sheds have made the huge mistake of having all this great machinery and nowhere to make a cup of coffee or to have lunch. And there are actually some sheds like the one in Brimbank in Sunshine where there is a hammer. I found it in a cupboard once. But otherwise there are no tools. Sally, you've been there and seen it. They've got a coffee machine, but they don't have any tools. So And if anybody's interested, we do have a shed crawl after the Australian Men's Sheds Association conference in Ballarat, and you can register on the Adult Learning Australia. So if you've never been into a shed, and women can do it too, we're having breakfast in the Ballarat East Community Shed, morning tea in the Bunningmill Men's Shed, lunch in the Winchelsea Men's Shed, afternoon tea in the Geelong Community Shed, and we're having a full meal in the Geelong East Men's Shed in Woolap. So,
can I just ask, do the men do the cooking?
Actually, in the shed we're starting at, in the Ballarat East Community Shed last year, when we did the men's shed crawl, we finished the shed crawl in Ballarat. Yes, they catered, but yeah, the attitudes towards that sort of stuff varies. I should say that for those of you who are sort of wondering, because you haven't asked me the question, and people are often afraid to ask, what about women? The shed makes the decision about whether women are welcome or not. Research shows that it works better if it's just for men. Full stop.
Can I ask you about research before we get into the differences between men and women and what they require for mental health or learning opportunities? So with this kind of thing, because any kind of funding is so competitive, I assume there has to be some kind of quantitative evaluation that it does have an impact on well-being or learning.
Yes, and Beyond Blue is currently doing that research with the Australian Men's Sheds Association, because while we've done some research, we know who goes, we know what they do, we know why men come. We can't prove that men live longer or that prevents dementia, and that sort of research is really difficult to do. But they're doing some baseline research to see what sort of health effects are associated with it. The difficulty, if you think about it as a researcher, if you just look at the men that come to sheds, you don't know about the health of men who don't come to sheds. So in a sense, it's like that $64 question, does coming to the sheds make them better, or do the men come because they're better than the men who don't come? That's sort of a complex question. But we're doing research, and I have to say anecdotally, I've done lots of interviews, and one man said to me, and he said it really quietly, he was 93 and he could barely speak, and I said, why do you come here? And he said, without the shed, I'd be dead. He was a former professor of dentistry at the University of Sydney, and I've had men who are blind with dementia come to the shed, and when they get off the bus, because they come in some places by bus, the tears roll down his cheeks because he can smell the wood, and he used to be a woodworker. And he can't do anything with chisels or drop saws because that'd be dreadfully dangerous. But he can sand, and he can paint, and he can feel the wood. But it's that sort of, so when people say, what does it do? It does wonderful things for people. It does wonderful things, and this is where it's great also for families, because many men come with the active support and encouragement of their female partner often. But just for those women in the audience who think they can send their men to the men's sheds, the sheds have a rule. If the women dump their men there and leave them there, they won't take them unless the man comes in voluntarily. You can't dump your man at a shed if you remember nothing else.
I won't wander into the territory of gender differences and so on.
Look,
that's what it's about, I assume.
Some sheds say it's just for men. Some sheds say we don't care if women come as long as they let us behave like blokes. That's basically what research shows. And some community sheds actually say we couldn't call it a community sheds because we wouldn't be allowed to open, so they call it a community shed. But the reality is, even in the community sheds, people who are a bit smart realise that it actually works best, particularly for men who are damaged, who've had difficult lives, who've got problems with incontinence or disability or dementia, for blokes just to do bloke stuff. And that's why they work. And I just think we have to sort of bite the bullet and say, if it's good for men at that age, why should it be open to women?
It's addressing men's needs.
It is.
Women
and the Equal Opportunity Commissioner for Australia, Elizabeth Broderick's made it quite clear they don't violate equal opportunity legislation. They're doing good work, good and healthy and community work. And that's the other important thing, and I'm going on. It's not just for the men. If you go to a place like Donald, where I come from originally, in the Wimmera, that shed has completed 58 community projects since it started, and they've just completely transformed the town. So it's transformed the community as well as the families, as well as the men.
Fantastic. Now I'll open it to you guys. Do you want to ask questions?
I'm associated with an organisation which has a men's shed. It's a small one. We found difficulties with it from the question of responsibility in terms of we have woodworking, various machinery and tools and what have you, and we've had to take very seriously the question of who's responsible, where does it fit into our organisation, if anything happens are we legally at fault, and it's raised a whole real raft of questions about whether we can in fact continue to run it because of all of those issues, plus the fact that we have people who ring us up and say that we wish to place someone at your shed as part of placement from there, and we say, well look, sorry, we don't have anyone who's actually full-time looking after this place, and they then hit us with the fact that we're discriminating against their person.
It's a really good question. All sheds have to be safe, it's the bottom line, and somebody has to be responsible all the time. You can't just have men wandering in and out on their own. If you've got equipment, then you have to have a tag on the equipment that says these are the people who can use it because they've been ticked off on using it. If they're not on the list, they can't use the machine. It has to be safe. Australian Men's Sheds Association has insurance for everybody who uses a shed, so my advice would be to get the shed manual, and it shows you how to make a shed safe, how to tick all the safety boxes, and how to, if you need to, adapt the equipment to suit the people. But you're right, you can't have people, for example, with dementia who are unsupervised walking around with drop saws. You just simply can't do it, it's not safe. And so all sheds have to be safe. They don't have a manager, but they do have somebody who's always responsible. So as long as the shed's open, there's somebody there who knows what's going on, and if they see people doing dangerous stuff, it stops. It's the bottom line. They have to be safe, but it's the biggest problem getting them set up. You're right.
Don't ask me to stand up, but just in response to this gentleman, my name is Darren. I'm from the Melbourne City Council. If you haven't already, certainly get in contact with the Australian Men's Shed Association. But sheds are really great at supporting each other. So get in contact with other sheds in your area. Come out and have a visit with us out at Melbourne Men's Shed. We'll give you all of our manuals and our processes and all of that sort of stuff. So sheds are really great at supporting each other because we've all dealt with these issues. And it's an increasing issue, this challenge of men being dumped at men's sheds. The issue that Barry mentioned before about, saying no if you're going to dump a bloke here, whether it's a wife or a paid carer or an organisation, that's probably the biggest challenge to the ongoing sustainability of men's sheds at the moment. As long as you focus on the safety aspects, and ours, we have a rule that if you're not going to contribute, that the blokes basically won't accept those blokes. Everyone's got to contribute in some way, either get involved in a community project, have a cup of coffee and talk to the other blokes. You can't come in and sit on your bum and contribute nothing, and that's really important. There's got to strike a balance between doing good things for blokes, but they're volunteers, they're not paid therapists, they're not experts, they're blokes wanting to get together for their own well-being as well as their communities.
Thank you, and I should say, Darren won't say this, but the shed he's been associated with at Melbourne, if you're wanting to see a Rolls-Royce shed from a Rolls-Royce council, that is, it's the Moorabool? Shire of Melbourne Shire. I mean, they fully fund the coordinator and they built the shed. Some local governments really get it, some don't. And can I just say, Victoria is shed heaven. We get more money from the state government in Victoria than any other place in the world. Honestly, the people in Ireland are looking across to what we're doing and saying, we wish we had some money because, as you know, they've got unemployment at 30% and they've got youth unemployment running at around 70%. And you imagine the needs of men across Ireland at the moment.
Thank you very much. I was hoping to leave it on a really positive note from you. No, but it's wonderful that this is happening here in Australia, and it's a fabulous initiative.
It's a great Australian invention.
Great, yes, another great Australian invention.